The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors, seeping through the thin soles of her worn leather shoes. It clung to the damp air of the lower kitchens, a permanent chill that made her bones ache. Alara felt it most keenly in her hands, which were perpetually chapped and red from scrubbing pots in icy water. But the deepest cold was the brand. It was a small, intricate rune etched onto the delicate skin of her throat, a spiraling knot of silver-black ink that felt like a shard of ice pressed against her voice. They had called it the Mark of Silence. A punishment, they'd said, for a child who dared to speak a truth no one wanted to hear. The brand was a cage, and her voice was its prisoner. To speak above a whisper sent a jolt of frigid pain through her, a cruel reminder to keep her head down and her thoughts to herself. So she existed in a world of whispers and shadows, an invisible girl in the bustling heart of the Frostfang citadel. She was one of many servants, a ghost who polished silver she would never use and prepared feasts she would never taste. The others gave her a wide berth, their eyes flicking to the mark on her throat with a mixture of pity and fear. She was branded, damaged, worthless. She had long ago stopped fighting the label. It was easier to simply accept it, to become as small and quiet as they believed her to be. Her world was the clatter of pots, the smell of roasting meat and old stone, and the dull, persistent ache in her back. It was not a life, it was an existence. And in all her 19 years, she had never known anything else. Hope was a dangerous thing, a flickering candle in a blizzard, and she had learned to snuff it out before it could burn her. The citadel was in a state of controlled chaos. He was returning. The Alpha King. Kaelin. A name spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the great halls and in fearful whispers in the servant quarters. The Frost King, they called him. A ruler of immense power, centuries old, whose heart was said to be as frozen as the northern peaks that gave his kingdom its name. Ilara had never seen him. He was a myth, a legend carved from ice and shadow. They said his eyes were the color of a winter sky and that he had not been seen to smile in over 200 years. His emotions were sealed, locked away behind a wall of impenetrable frost, making him the most ruthless and effective king the northern Pax had ever known. She was scrubbing a soot-stained hearth when the horns blew, their mournful cry echoing off the mountains. A shiver, entirely unrelated to the cold, traced a path down her spine. The head cook, a stout woman with a permanently sour expression, barked orders, sending servants scattering like frightened mice. Alara simply continued her work, her movements small and methodical. Kings and their returns had nothing to do with her, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. Later that day, Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor, swept through the kitchens. He was a man whose smile never reached his eyes, his movements as smooth and predatory as a hunting cat. His gaze passed over the bowing servants, dismissing them as part of the scenery, until it landed on Alara. Or more specifically, on the brand on her throat. A flicker of something, disdain, perhaps, crossed his features. "You," he said, his voice clipped. "There is a spill in the council chambers. A pitcher of wine. Clean it. The king is holding audience." It was not a request, and it was a punishment. The council chambers were forbidden territory for the lower staff, especially for someone branded. It was a deliberate humiliation. Alara simply nodded, her eyes downcast, and whispered, "Yes, Lord Valerius." The words were a faint rasp, barely audible, but the effort still sent a familiar, icy sting through her neck. She gathered a bucket and cloths, her hands trembling slightly. To be seen by the High Council, by the king himself, was a nightmare. Her purpose was to be invisible. Valerius was reminding her that even in her invisibility, she could be dragged into the light and scorned. The doors to the council chamber were massive constructs of dark wood and iron, pushed open just enough for her to slip through. The air inside was warmer, thick with the scent of beeswax, old parchment, and the sharp, clean aroma of pine from the roaring fire. A dozen lords were arrayed around a grand table, their fine furs and polished armor a stark contrast to her own threadbare tunic. And at the head of the table, on a throne carved to resemble intertwined wolves, sat the king. He was not what she had expected. The stories had not done him justice. They had spoken of his coldness, but not of the devastating beauty of it. He was like a glacier given human form, vast, ancient, and utterly merciless. His hair was the color of spun silver, and his face was all sharp angles and harsh lines, as if carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were silver, pale, and depthless, like a frozen lake under a winter moon. They held no warmth, no anger, no feeling at all. They were terrifyingly empty. She kept her head bowed, her focus entirely on the dark red stain on the flagstones near the throne. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She just had to clean the spill and disappear. Be invisible. She knelt, the cold of the stone a familiar shock to her knees. She dipped the cloth in the water, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the room. She could feel their eyes on her, on the ragged hem of her dress, on the shameful mark on her throat. Her hands were shaking so badly that she fumbled, the wet cloth slipping from her grasp and landing with a small, pathetic slap on the stone. A quiet snicker came from one of the lords. Humiliation burned hot in her cheeks. Then a voice, deep and resonant as the cracking of ice, cut through the air. Enough. It was one word, spoken without inflection, yet it carried an absolute authority that silenced the room instantly. Ilara froze, her hand hovering over the fallen cloth. She did not dare to look up. She felt a presence move, the subtle shift of air as someone rose. Heavy, booted footsteps approached, stopping just before her. A shadow fell over her, blocking the light from the fire. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a blow, for a harsh word of dismissal, for the wrath of the Frost King. Instead, she felt a strange, impossible warmth. Fingers, surprisingly gentle, tipped her chin upwards, forcing her to meet his gaze. She found herself looking into those silver, empty eyes. They were fixed on her, but not with disgust or anger. They were curious. His focus was sharp, intense, as if he were seeing something no one else could. His gaze dropped to the brand on her throat. A muscle in his jaw tightened, the only sign of any reaction. His thumb, calloused and large, brushed against the mark. Ilara flinched, not from pain, but from shock. The touch did not bring the usual icy sting. Instead, a wave of gentle warmth spread from his skin to hers, a soothing heat that seemed to quiet the frantic beating of her heart. It was the first warmth she had felt on that patch of skin since the branding needle had done its cruel work. What was happening? Kaylin's eyes lifted back to hers. For the barest fraction of a second, she thought she saw something flicker in their frozen depths, a spark, a question. He withdrew his hand and the warmth vanished, leaving the cold to rush back in, more biting than before. He turned his gaze upon the rest of the room. "Leave us," he commanded. The voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but the order was absolute. Lord Valerius stepped forward, his expression a carefully crafted mask of concern. "Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. She is merely a branded servant." "I am aware of what she is." Kaylin cut him off, his silver eyes flashing with a light that was not reflected from the fire. "Leave. Now." The lords scrambled to obey, their haste a testament to the king's power. Valerius gave Ilara a look of pure venom before sweeping out of the room, the heavy doors closing behind him with a definitive boom. They were alone. The silence was vast, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Alara was still kneeling on the floor, trapped in the force of his presence. She was terrified, but beneath the fear, a new feeling was taking root. Confusion. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "You will serve me directly now," he stated. It wasn't an offer. It was a fact. "You will be housed in the chambers adjoining my own." Alara's mind reeled. Her? A personal attendant to the king? It was impossible. She was a nobody. A pariah. She found her voice, a thread of a whisper. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. He did not answer immediately. He simply watched her, his gaze so intense, it felt as though he were peeling back the layers of her soul, looking for something hidden deep inside. "Because you are the first thing I have felt in a century," he said, his voice quiet, almost a confession. "And I wish to know why." The arrangement was as stark and cold as the king himself. Alara was moved from her cramped cot in the servants' barracks to a chamber that felt impossibly large and empty. It had a real bed with furs, a small hearth that was always lit, and a window that looked out over the snow-dusted courtyard. It was more luxury than she had ever known, yet it felt like a gilded cage. Her duties were simple. She brought him his meals, which he rarely touched. She kept the fire in his study roaring, fighting back the unnatural chill that always seemed to linger around him. She stood silently in the corner of the room while he worked, a living shadow against the stone walls. He rarely spoke to her. His commands were clipped, impersonal. More wood. Tea. Leave. And yet, his eyes were always on her. When he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch him watching her. His silver gaze filled with that same unnerving intensity from their first meeting. He was studying her, trying to solve a puzzle she didn't even know she presented. The court was in an uproar. Whispers followed her everywhere she went. They called her the king's pet, his new amusement. Lord Valerius regarded her with open hostility, his cold eyes promising retribution. The other servants, who had once ignored her, now recoiled as if she carried a plague. She had never been more isolated. She learned the rhythms of the king's loneliness. He never slept. Long after the citadel was dark and silent, a light would burn in his study. Sometimes she would hear him pacing, the heavy, restless tread of a caged wolf. The stories said he was unfeeling, but Alara began to see that wasn't true. He was not empty. He was haunted. The frost around him was not a weapon, but a prison. One evening, she brought his supper tray to the study. He was standing by the great arched window, staring out at the falling snow. He did not turn as she entered. "They say the first snow of winter holds the memories of the past year," he said, his voice strangely soft. It was the most he had said to her in a week. Alara hesitated, placing the tray on a small table. She did not know how to respond. She was not supposed to have opinions. "What do you think?" he pressed, still not looking at her. She swallowed, the brand on her throat giving a familiar, warning twinge. "I think," she whispered, her voice barely stirring the air, "that some memories are better left forgotten." At that, he finally turned. His silver eyes met hers, and for a moment, the icy mask slipped. She saw a flash of profound, ancient sorrow, a grief so deep it seemed to have carved the harsh lines into his face. The moment passed, and the frost returned, but she had seen it. A crack in the ice. He did not dismiss her. Instead, he gestured to a chair near the fire. "Stay." She sat cautiously on the edge of the seat, her hands clenched in her lap. He remained by the window, a silent, imposing figure against the swirling white outside. They sat that way for what felt like hours, in a silence that was not empty, but filled with unspoken things. It was a strange sort of companionship, a shared solitude. These moments began to happen more frequently. A quiet question here, a shared silence there. He never asked her about the court, about politics or power. He asked her what she thought of the wind, if she preferred sunrise or sunset, what the bread in the kitchens tasted like. Small, simple, human things, as if he were trying to remember how to be human himself. He never demanded she speak louder than a whisper. He would lean closer, his attention absolute, catching her faint words as if they were precious jewels. He seemed to understand, without her ever saying it, that the brand was not just a mark, but a source of constant pain. One night, a chill more bitter than usual had settled over the castle. Alara was adding a log to the fire in his study when her hand trembled, a spasm of cold and exhaustion. The log slipped, sending a shower of sparks onto the hearth. She gasped, the sound sharp and involuntary, and clutched her throat as the brand flared with icy fire. Kalen was across the room in an instant. "Are you hurt?" His voice was sharp, the closest to alarm she had ever heard from him. She shook her head, tears of pain welling in her eyes. She couldn't speak. She absently rubbed the mark, a useless gesture she'd done 1,000 times. His hand covered hers, stilling the movement. His skin was cool, but not the deathly cold she expected. It was the cool of riverstone, solid and real. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. His eyes were fixed on the brand, and the emptiness in them had been replaced by a terrifying stillness, the calm at the center of a storm. The question itself was a revelation. No one had ever asked. They had only ever seen the mark, not the story behind it. She found her breath, forcing out the words in a pained whisper. My village elders. I was a child. I saw something, a theft by one of them. I spoke of it." His grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. "They branded you for telling the truth." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet fury that was more frightening than any shout. She could only nod, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. He released her hand and gently brushed the tear away with his thumb. His touch was hesitant, as if he were unaccustomed to such gestures. "They were wrong," he said, his silver eyes boring into hers. "To silence a voice that speaks the truth is the greatest of sins." In that moment, something shifted between them, irrevocably. He was not just her king, and she was not just his servant. He saw her. Not the brand, not the outcast, but the girl who had been punished for her integrity. And she saw him. Not the Frost King, not the unfeeling monster, but a man trapped in an endless winter who recognized a fellow prisoner. The boundary they had lived by, the unspoken arrangement of master and servant, was beginning to erode. The ice was thawing, and neither of them knew what would be revealed in the flood. Lord Valerius watched the thawing with a cold, calculating gaze. He had spent decades carefully managing the king's frozen apathy, using it to steer the kingdom as he saw fit. The king was a figurehead, a weapon to be pointed. Valerius was the hand that aimed him. This branded servant girl was a complication he could not afford. She was changing the king. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible to others, but Valerius saw it. He saw the way Kalen's eyes followed her, the way he lingered in his study when she was there. He saw the flicker of something other than emptiness in that silver gaze, and it terrified him. A king with feelings was a king who could not be controlled. He began his campaign subtly, a whispered word to a lady-in-waiting about the girl's strange influence, a suggestion to a council member that the king's judgment was becoming erratic. He painted Alara as a witch, a seductress who had cast a spell on their unassailable ruler. The brand on her throat became his proof, a mark of darkness, a sign of her corrupt nature. Alara felt the shift. The stares became more hostile, the whispers more venomous. She tried to ignore it, to retreat further into her shell, But the poison was spreading. She was no longer just an outcast, she was a threat. The opportunity Valerius had been waiting for arrived with a delegation from the Southern Sunstone Pack. It was a tense alliance, one that required careful diplomacy. A great feast was held in their honor. Valerius personally instructed the head cook that Alara, and only Alara, was to serve the king and the Sunstone Alpha their wine. Alara's hands shook as she poured the deep red liquid into the ornate goblets. She could feel Valerius's eyes on her from his seat at the high table. Every nerve screamed that this was a trap. She served the Sunstone Alpha first, then King Kalin. Her movements were careful, precise. Nothing went wrong. She was retreating back to the shadows near the wall when the Sunstone Alpha choked. He gasped, his face turning a sickly shade of purple, and clawed at his throat before collapsing to the floor. The hall erupted into chaos. The Sunstone warriors drew their blades. The Citadel guards formed a defensive line. And in the center of it all, Lord Valerius stood, his arm outstretched, his finger pointing directly at Ilara. "The witch!" he bellowed, his voice ringing with false fury. "She has poisoned him! Seize her!" Before Ilara could even process what was happening, two guards grabbed her arms, their grips like iron vices. She looked desperately towards Kalin. He was on his feet, his face a mask of cold fury, but he was surrounded by the chaos, trying to maintain order. "The brand on her throat is a sorcerer's sigil," Valerius shouted, his voice cutting through the din. "She has ensnared our king and now attempts to start a war. I saw her slip something into the goblet." It was a lie, a perfect, devastating lie. And in a room filled with fear and suspicion, it was a lie they were all too willing to believe. "Take her to the ice dungeons," Valerius commanded the guards, usurping the king's authority in the confusion. "She will await judgment." The guards dragged her from the hall. Her last sight was of Kalin, his silver eyes finding hers across the room. She saw not accusation, but a silent, terrible promise. He did not believe it, but it was too late. The trap had been sprung. The ice dungeons were a place of legend, a frigid hell carved into the very heart of the mountain beneath the citadel. The cold here was a living thing, malicious and hungry. It sank its teeth into her flesh, stealing the breath from her lungs and turning her blood to slush. There was no fire, no furs, only stone, ice, and a darkness that was absolute. She was chained to the wall, the iron cuffs biting into her wrists, colder than any metal had a right to be. The poison, she realized, had not been lethal. The Sunstone Alpha would recover. It was never about killing him. It was about framing her. It was about removing her from the board so Valerius could reclaim his king. Days bled into a timeless agony. She lost track of the hours, measuring time only in the cycles of her own shivering. Hope, the candle she had so carefully guarded, was finally extinguished, its last wisp of smoke stolen by the suffocating cold. This was how she would die, alone, in the dark, branded a witch and a traitor. Then she heard footsteps, not the heavy tread of the guards, but a measured, determined pace. A torch flared to life outside her cell, casting long, dancing shadows. Lord Valerius stood there, his face illuminated by the flickering light. He was smiling. "It is a shame it had to come to this," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You are an interesting distraction for him." Ilara simply stared at him, too cold and tired to even feel hatred. "He returned, you know," Valerius continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Broke all records riding back from the border after he settled things with the Sunstone Pack. He was displeased. He demanded your release." A tiny, treacherous spark ignited in her chest. "But the council is a fickle thing," Valerius sighed dramatically. "They have seen how your presence has unbalanced him. They believe you have clouded his judgment. They believe he is compromised. They believe me." The spark died. He fought them. For you. Can you imagine? The Frost King, showing passion. It was the final proof they needed that you had to be destroyed. Valeria stepped closer to the bars. So I offered a solution, a way to restore the king to his former glory, to cleanse him of your influence and make him the strong, unfeeling ruler our kingdom needs. He held up a small obsidian box. It seemed to drink the torchlight, radiating a cold that was even deeper than that of the dungeon. An ancient relic, the heart frost. It can amplify the seal on his emotions, make it permanent. It will lock away the man and leave only the monarch. He will be perfect. He will be mine to command. And he will not even remember your name. A scream of protest died in Alara's throat, choked by the brand's icy grip. No, he couldn't. The ceremony is about to begin in the Great Hall, Valerius said, his smile widening. He fought, of course, but the council has sanctioned it. It is for his own good, for the good of the kingdom. He turned to leave, tossing a final, cruel remark over his shoulder. Do not worry. You will not be alone down here for long. Once he is restored, his first act will be to sign your execution order. It is only logical. The torchlight receded, plunging her back into darkness. But it was no longer an empty dark. It was filled with the horror of his words. They were not just killing her. They were erasing him. They were taking the man who had shown her the first flicker of warmth in her life and encasing him in eternal ice. She pulled at her chains, a raw, desperate sound tearing from her throat. The brand flared, a blinding agony, but she didn't care. She had to get to him. She had to stop them. Hours later, she heard it. A collective gasp from the castle above, a tremor that seemed to run through the very stone. Then, a slow, solemn procession of footsteps. They were coming closer. Her cell door was opened, not by Valerius, but by two grim-faced guards. They did not look at her. They unlocked her chains and pulled her to her feet. The king is to be laid in state in the ice crypt, one of them muttered. The council has ordered that the witch who killed him be present to witness her handiwork before her sentencing. Killed him? No. They dragged her up from the dungeons, her half-frozen limbs protesting with every step. They emerged into a corridor lined with shocked and weeping servants, and through the open doors of the great hall, she saw him. Kaelin was on a stone bier, surrounded by the council. Lord Valerius stood over him, holding the now empty obsidian box. The king was not dead. He was frozen. His skin was coated in a thick layer of crystalline frost, his silver hair indistinguishable from the ice that encased him. His face was peaceful, but it was the peace of absolute stillness, the peace of a statue. The relic had not just sealed his emotions, it was consuming his life force, turning him into a monument of ice. He was dying. And as they began to carry the bier past her cell on its way to the crypt, something inside Alara broke. It was not a quiet snap. It was a shattering, a cataclysmic explosion of every feeling she had suppressed for her entire life. The fear, the loneliness, the quiet desperation, and towering above it all, a fierce, defiant, all-consuming love for the frozen man on the bier. He had seen her. He had touched her pain and called it unjust. He had given her a flicker of warmth in an endless winter, and she would not let them take him. A roar of pure denial built in her chest, a force far greater than the brand that sought to contain it. She wrenched her arm free from the guard's grasp with impossible strength. Kaelin! The name ripped from her throat, not as a whisper, but as a full-throated shout that echoed through the stone halls. The brand on her neck exploded with pain, an agony beyond anything she had ever known, but it was followed by a sensation of pure, liberating heat. A crack of brilliant white light erupted from her skin. The silver-black rune glowed, sizzled, and then shattered into 1,000 motes of fading light, leaving behind smooth, unmarred skin. Her voice was free. The guards stared at her, stunned. Lord Valerius, standing by the bier, turned with a look of disbelief. Ilara didn't hesitate. She ran. She pushed past the stunned guards, her focus entirely on the frozen king. A wave of energy, warm and bright as the summer sun, pulsed from her. The guards who tried to intercept her were thrown back, not by a violent force, but by a gentle, irresistible wave of warmth and light. She reached the bier, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm. She could feel the deathly cold rolling off his body, a palpable aura of oblivion. "No," she whispered, her voice clear and strong. "I will not let you go." She placed her hands on his chest. The frost covering him was so cold it burned her skin, but she ignored the pain. She closed her eyes and reached for that new, unfamiliar warmth inside her, the light that had shattered her brand. She poured it all into him. It was not a conscious act. It was instinct. It was love. She poured her memories of his quiet kindness, the feeling of his thumb brushing away her tear, the warmth of his hand on hers. She poured her life, her soul, her very essence into the unbreachable cold. The light grew, emanating from her hands, from her heart. It was a miniature sun, blazing in the dim hallway, pushing back the shadows, pushing back the cold. She felt her own energy draining, her vision starting to tunnel, but she did not stop. She would give him every last drop of her warmth, even if it meant leaving none for herself. Then she heard a crack. It was a sound like a frozen river breaking up in the spring thaw. It came from Kaylin's chest, right beneath her hands. The crystalline frost began to splinter, fine cracks spreading across his body like a spiderweb. The light from her hands intensified, pouring into the fissures. With a sound like 1,000 shattering mirrors, the ice exploded away from him, turning to harmless vapor in the sudden, intense heat. Kaylin gasped, a deep, shuddering intake of breath. His silver eyes flew open. They were no longer empty. They were blazing with life, with confusion, with pain, and with a raw, unsealed emotion that stole her breath. He pushed himself up on his elbows, his gaze immediately finding hers. He saw her, pale and swaying, the light receding back into her like a dying star. As she collapsed, his arms, now strong and warm, shot out and caught her, pulling her against his bare chest. The world swam back into focus slowly. The first thing Ilara was aware of was the warmth. A steady, solid heat against her back, her cheek pressed against something hard and alive. She heard a heartbeat. Strong, steady, and close. So close. She opened her eyes. She was cradled in Kaylin's arms, his grip fiercely protective. He was looking down at her, and the expression on his face shattered her. The frost was gone. All of it. His silver eyes, no longer lakes of ice, were turbulent storms of emotion. Relief, terror, gratitude, and a love so profound it felt like the foundation of the world. He was alive. He was warm. He was feeling. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. It was awe. She lifted a trembling hand to her throat, to the place where a lifetime of pain and shame had resided. It was smooth. The cage was gone. "You saw me," she whispered back, her voice, her true voice, clear and steady. A movement caught her eye. Lord Valerius was staring at them, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. The obsidian box lay shattered on the floor beside him. His plan was in ruins. Kaylin's head lifted, his gaze shifting to his former advisor. The love in his eyes was replaced by a cold, lethal fury that was all the more terrifying for the passion that now fueled it. "You tried to cage a storm," he said, his voice low and thundering, "and you tried to extinguish the sun." Valerius stumbled back, his composure finally breaking. "I did it for the kingdom. You were becoming weak, sentimental." "You mistake feeling for weakness," Kalen growled, rising to his feet with Alara still held securely in his arms. He did not take his eyes off Valerius. My strength was a prison. She did not weaken me. She set me free. He nodded to the guards, who, after a moment of stunned hesitation, moved to apprehend the trembling lord. Justice would be swift and absolute. But Kalen's attention was already back on her. He carried her away from the chaos of the hall, through the corridors of a castle that suddenly felt like it was breathing again, and into his private chambers. He set her down gently on the furs by the hearth, never letting her go, as if he feared she might fade away. He knelt before her, cradling her face in his hands. His touch was no longer hesitant, it was sure, reverent. "Alara," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "The light, the warmth. What did you do?" "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I just couldn't let you go. It was your life force. You poured it into me." He looked at her, his expression shadowed with a terrible fear. "You almost died." "You were dying," she countered softly. A tear, a single, perfect drop of moisture, welled in his silver eye and traced a path down his cheek. The first tear he had shed in centuries. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her skin. "I love you," he said, the words raw and broken, as if they had been trapped behind a dam for an eternity. "I think I have from the moment you looked at me and did not flinch. I did not have a name for it then. I did not have a name for anything, but I do now. It is love." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "My bloodline is cursed. They say to love is to die." She looked at him, at the vibrant life pulsing in him, at the raw emotion in his beautiful, stormy eyes, and she felt no fear. Her light had not just broken his frost, it had broken his curse. They were two halves of a whole, his ancient power and her nascent light. "Then we will face it together," she said, her voice full of a strength she never knew she possessed. She leaned in and kissed him, a soft, gentle press of lips that sealed a promise made in silence and forged in sacrifice. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. A quiet affirmation that two broken souls could find a way to be whole. 3 months later, Alara stood on the grand balcony of the citadel, a fine cloak of white wolf fur settled over her shoulders. The air was still cold, but it was the bright, clean cold of late winter, pregnant with the promise of spring. The kingdom, which had been locked in a perpetual emotional frost under its sealed king, was stirring back to life. Laughter could be heard from the courtyards, a sound that had been absent for too long. She was no longer a servant, no longer the branded girl. She was Queen Alara, the Sunheart, the woman who had thawed the Frost King. It was a title that still felt foreign, a gown that didn't quite fit. But the woman inside it was finally, truly herself. Warm, strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar chin rested on her shoulder. Kalen's presence was a constant, grounding warmth at her back. He no longer fought his emotions. He reveled in them. He smiled freely now, a breathtaking sight that could make the entire court fall silent. He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. He ruled not with cold logic, but with a fierce, passionate justice, tempered by a compassion she had helped him rediscover. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice a soft rumble against her ear. "I was thinking about the first day I saw you," she confessed. "In the council chamber. I was so afraid." He turned her in his arms, his silver eyes soft. "I was the one who was afraid. You knelt before me, covered in soot, with a mark of injustice on your throat. And you looked up at me with more strength in your eyes than I had seen in my entire council. You did not cower." He paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. He traced the smooth skin of her throat where the brand had once been, a gesture he often did, as if reassuring himself it was truly gone. I asked my guards later, he said quietly. Why won't she bow? I had commanded the room to be cleared, yet you remained kneeling, cleaning a mess that was not yours, looking up at me. You would not lower your head. Ilara met his gaze, the memory clear in her mind. She had been frozen, yes, by fear and confusion, but there had been something else too. A flicker of defiance she hadn't even recognized in herself. A refusal to be shamed. They tried to teach me that my voice was worthless, she said, her own voice clear and musical in the crisp air. That I should always bend my head in shame and accept my place. She reached up and cupped his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin. Because you did not need someone who would bow, she said, the words resonating with the absolute truth she had been punished for once before. You needed someone who would not. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features into something beautiful and open. It was the smile of a man who had been saved not by a submissive servant, but by an equal, a partner, a queen who had taught him that true strength was not the absence of feeling, but the courage to embrace it. He leaned down and kissed her, a deep, loving kiss filled with the promise of the coming spring, and of a new world they would build together, forged not in ice, but in light.